Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. So last time we ended off talking about ancient Rome, and we were looking at, how Rome developed a kind of naturalism that we refer to as the warts and all style. It's continuing this kind of trend to naturalism that arose in the, ancient Greek period. However, we'll start to see today with, the beginnings of early Christianity that trend begins to go back in the opposite direction as well. I've always found this to be kind of interesting in that throughout history there tends to be this kind of ebb and flow of abstraction and realism, then abstraction, then realism, and whatnot. Today, once again, beginning with the early Christian period and then bridging into Byzantine art. Just to jump off, as Rome began to decline and Christianity became more established, the depiction of realism begins to diminish within, the art world. And there are some major reasons for this. First and foremost, a lot of early Christian art during the Roman period, the late Roman period especially, is really beginning to reject a lot of the major trends within Roman society. And this is in part due to early Christians' persecution under the Roman Empire. But we will also begin to see, especially as the Bible becomes more formalized, that a lot of Christians are starting to kind of get hung up on this controversy between the biblical prohibition against, idolatry or, worshiping of engraven images, but also this need for imagery to, help teach an illiterate public. Many of the artists dealing with artwork in the early Christian period begin to embrace more stylization and abstraction once again, so as to not be in competition with the divine creation, if you will. And so we'll see today this kind of trend of going back towards rather pronounced stylization and abstraction as opposed to naturalism or reality or anything like that. But early Christians do incorporate Roman aesthetics to some degree, but they begin to distance themselves from Rome's pagan traditions as time goes on. And so once again, we touched on this a little bit last time. There are kind of efforts by the early Catholic Church in particular to adopt certain customs from Roman paganism in order to better win over converts to Christianity. But over time, that begins to be much more downplayed, and Christian traditions and whatnot become more established. And so it's just kind of an interesting phenomenon that happens. But we should all be somewhat familiar, with early Christianity's relationship to ancient Rome. It was not very good in the beginning. Here we can see a 19th century painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, which is depicting that whole kind of idea of Christian persecution. If you've ever wondered why that was, in ancient Rome, many of the later kind of emperors begin to promote the idea that the Roman emperors are actually living gods, similar to the pharaohs and everything. So they actually initiated a law under, Roman law that stated that all citizens of the empire had to make offerings or sacrifices at temples devoted to the deity of the emperors. And so obviously, Christians do not recognize the kind of divine status of the Roman emperors. They're only, or, in general, the pantheon of Roman gods. Instead, they're only looking at the legitimacy of the one God. So there's a lot of conflict that arises there. And so, early Christians are widely considered to be criminals, in, or at least by ancient Roman law. And so they begin to be persecuted in the Colosseum and in other forms, other places. This is specifically, kind of reminiscent of the persecution by the Emperor Nero, one of the more controversial, Roman emperors in terms of their relationship to Christianity. It's known that he would actually, tie Christians up on stakes, such as we see in the background here, and light them on fire in order to, light his gardens at nighttime. And he was very debauched, very, corrupt and brutal Roman emperor. But once again, early Christianity and its relationship to the Roman Empire is very strained, and consequently, because of this, a lot of early Christian devotion, faith, practice, all of this stuff has to be driven underground, both literally and metaphorically speaking. And so, what we see is, a lot of the earliest Christian art forms, as well as the earliest Christian sanctuaries, are actually physically underground in the kind of labyrinthian tunnel system under Rome that known as the catacombs. And so here we can see one of these one of the earliest Christian churches, and this is in the catacombs of Santa Domitillo in Rome, and it's dated to between the 2nd and 4th century CE. So the latter kind of 2 centuries of the Roman Empire there. But what's interesting is that this kind of serves a variety of functions. Not only is it an underground sanctuary in which we can remain, kind of anonymous from the Roman elites and whatnot, but it also serves a practical function as well in terms of burial. So in ancient Rome, it was much more common to cremate the dead, and so you would only have the ashes and everything left. However, Christian dogma dictates that the body must remain intact for the last judgment and the resurrection and all of this kind of idea. So these catacombs really are born out of a practical need for burial space, but then once again they also serve the practical need of a kind of secluded sanctuary for our religious devotion and everything like that. So in these spaces, though, we do begin to see many of the first kind of motifs and major kind of subject matter and symbolic kind of motifs that will be adopted into later Christian artwork and aesthetic as well. But what I find interesting is that, and we can perhaps see this in some of this, that many of these early Christians are actually Roman citizens themselves. And so a lot of this the earliest Christian artwork from the first few centuries is really kind of reminiscent of Roman artwork in general, in that we're going to see, people depicted in Roman garb, so togas and, all of that kind of stuff. And we might see, depictions of, biblical figures that look more akin to Roman citizens than they do to our traditional note, or at least our notion of how they should look based on, later artwork and whatnot. So once again, here we can see some of that. So we can see the figure of Jesus up here on the top of the ceiling is actually depicted in a Roman toga. And it's important to note that Jesus himself, although not technically a Roman citizen, lived in Judea, which was a province of the Roman Empire. So once again, many of these, earliest Christian peoples are, Roman citizens themselves, or they're at least interacting within the Roman world. And so there is a kind of crossover of those aesthetics beginning early on, but then over time it gradually kind of fades away and becomes its own uniquely Christian aesthetic. But we see all kinds of different work in these catacombs. Here we can see a major symbolic motif that's very prevalent within early Christian art, but also just Christian art in general. So what we see here is this comes from the catacombs of Priscilla, also from Rome, dated to between the 2nd and 4th century CE. But this is a motif that comes to be known as the Good Shepherd. And so this is a very common motif across, all of Christian art. But we have the figure of Jesus here, and interestingly, he is not depicted in our normal view of Jesus with the beard and long hair and all that, but instead is depicted basically as a Roman citizen. We see him in, fairly typical, kind of Roman clothing from that time. But once again, this is a painting located in Rome itself. So there is some commonality there. But we can see that this Good Shepherd motif comes to represent, the Christian faithful in general, in that, they see themselves as the flock, and their shepherd is, Christ himself, and all of this kind of idea. So you'll oftentimes see this Good Shepherd motif used, time and time again. But in this, we can also see another major symbolic motif within Christian art as well. And so we can perhaps notice the two doves, which are both holding laurel wreaths on either side of the figure of Christ here. And once again, the dove usually comes to be synonymous with the Holy Spirit, or God Himself. So many times too, the dove comes to represent aspects of the Trinity, so the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, whole idea like that. But once again, we can see very, very early on that many of these very typical symbolic motifs are beginning to emerge, and these will be echoed forth for even into the modern day. But once again, I like some of these early kind of catacomb depictions in these small kind of underground chapels, because it shows us a different view of this kind of narrative than we typically think. So once again, here we can see another kind of atypical representation of the figure of Jesus again. So what we see here is Christ among His apostles. This is actually meant to be a Last Supper scene, and so we see the figure of Christ here in the middle. But once again, all of these figures are wearing Roman togas. This was made by Roman citizens in the city of Rome itself. So they're basing the depiction on what they know. They had probably never actually been to Judea. They probably, never actually, interacted with Christians from that region necessarily. So they're using their own aesthetic trends and everything like that. But we can see that it begins to become a little bit less realistic than some of the other Roman art forms. And there are reasons for that. One, in particular, we're not trying to be in competition with, God or the divine creation, but also, this would be more of a fringe aspect of society, in that most of these early Christians are not going to be, wealthy elites. So they're not going to be able to, hire the best painters. They're having to do it themselves. So it's almost a kind of naive or outsider art form in this regard as well. But I've always found that to be kind of interesting. Now, the Roman Emperor Constantine formally recognizes Christianity as an official state religion of the Roman Empire in 313 CE. And so this is said to take place because of the event that we see depicted here. And this is a Renaissance painting that is meant to depict the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And so during this battle, or I should say before the battle, Constantine, who we see depicted on horseback in gold here, was said to have witnessed a kind of miraculous sign in the sky, in which several angels appeared to him with the sign of the Chi-Rho, which is a kind of early Christian symbol that predates the use of the crucifix as its main kind of symbolic link. But the Chi-Rho, if you're unfamiliar, and we'll see an example here in a minute, is a P with an X crossing it. So the angels are said to have told Constantine, in this sign you will conquer. And so he goes on and wins this battle, and he takes that as a kind of prophetic, revelation, and he then adopts Christianity as his own faith, but then also makes it the official faith of the empire itself. And so this is important because he, eliminates the ancient Roman pagan kind of religion, or at least, begins the process of eliminating it. It will kind of hang on for a few centuries after this, but it's important to note that this is the kind of pivotal moment in which Christianity is first recognized as a legitimate religion and everything like that. But Constantine begins to, embrace Christianity not only as a practice, but in his own lifetime or lifestyle. He also reflects it in many of his artworks, or I should say artworks associated with him. So here we can see what's known as the head of Constantine. This is actually one of a few pieces of this that survived to this day, but it was originally a very massive sculpture. I believe it was originally over 40 feet tall. The head here itself is at least 5 or 6 feet tall. It's very big. But we can perhaps see that we are starting to shift away from this very realistic, naturalistic Roman aesthetic within sculpture. And this is most evident in the eyes. So we can see that those eyes definitely appear to be much bigger, much more widely open than, say, they might normally look. So it's exaggerated somewhat. But the reason for this is to echo this idea of inner spiritual awakening. So it's meant to be this kind of subtle homage to our inner spiritual light coming alive for the first time. Once again, we have this kind of prophetic revelation in which, or an epiphany, if you will, in which our entire mindset is completely changed. So it's very, very subtle. Once again, it will take some time for this, kind of predominant Roman aesthetic to be supplanted by this, kind of more abstract and stylized Christian aesthetic that develops throughout the Middle Ages. But this is kind of one of the first, stepping points in that direction. So kind of interesting there. However, in 330 CE, Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome itself to Constantinople. So he moves it from the traditional capital of Rome over to Constantinople, or modern day Istanbul in Turkey there. But about 60 years later, in 395 CE, the empire officially splits between the Latin West and the Greek-speaking East. And so it creates a major political distinction. Each of the kind of halves of the Roman Empire were ruled by a separate emperor. And what we really see during this is the gradual decline of the Western Empire. And so in 476 CE, the Western Empire falls to barbarian invasions from Germany and Eurasia. So we actually have the Hunnic, kind of conquest of Central Asia. So we have the Huns coming out of the Central Asian steppe, kind of off in this region, and they begin to invade Europe through here, which begins to push, Germanic and Slavic barbarian peoples, into the Roman Western Empire. And at this point, the Roman, kind of army is starting to wane in its effectiveness. Prior to this, and centuries prior, it was required that all Roman soldiers be Roman citizens. So they had a kind of sense of duty when they're fighting for the empire. But at this point, most of the legions are comprised of mercenaries who are fighting for, loot and plunder and all kinds of stuff like that. So they don't really have the allegiance to Rome like, they might have in the past. So they don't really care about defending Rome. And so most of the time they either just, kind of cede things to the Huns, or they begin to, kind of turn on their Roman kind of officers and whatnot. And they begin to invade Rome itself to escape some of these other prevailing invasions and whatnot. And so we start to see the weakening of the Western Empire quite extensively in that regard. And then eventually it completely collapses as a political entity. And we start to have, the beginnings of feudalism and the beginnings of the modern nation states of like Spain and France and Germany and whatnot that we think of today in that regard. But something else I find interesting is that the Eastern Roman Empire becomes known as the Byzantine Empire, and it actually lasts until the 15th century CE, so well into the Renaissance period. It basically is completely done by the end of the Crusades in the middle of the Middle Ages there. But once again, there are portions in time, and we'll see some of this in a little bit, where the Eastern Roman Empire will try to, recapture the former, Western half and everything, and it's moderately successful at that at certain points. But generally speaking, what we'll be talking about from this point on is the Byzantine Empire. So One of the major aspects of Byzantine artwork and, in general, early Christian artwork is the basilica, and this is really more of an architectural form. And this is what many of the first kind of above ground, not in the catacomb, church spaces were adapted from. So basilica refers to an assembly hall, and this was adopted from Rome and transformed into the earliest Christian places of worship. So aside from those kind of catacomb chapels, if you will. But here we can see what a typical Roman basilica would look like. These were typically used for things like law courts. So in the apse or the semicircular ends that we see here, we would have, say, like a judge or a tribunal that would sit there and they would hear legal disputes. This would also just be a kind of place for public gatherings and other things like that. But in the early, Christian period, many of these, basilicas begin to be adapted for Christian use after they're abandoned by, the fall of Rome and all of this kind of thing. But what we'll see is that the major aspect of this will be translated into the earliest Christian churches. And so you might have heard this referred to, in fact, St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican in Rome is originally adapted from one of these ancient Roman basilicas. And so here we can see a Renaissance drawing of what the original St. Peter's Basilica looked like. The Roman Basilica itself is this structure right here, the kind of rectilinear structure. It had later additions throughout the Middle Ages of the courtyard, the kind of baptistry over here, as well as the transept arm in the back here. But the ancient Roman structure that was adapted is this structure right here in the middle. But it's something that is echoed into church architecture even today. I've actually been seeing there's kind of a resurgence of this basilica style within Christian churches, especially Catholic churches. And everything. But here we can see a cross section. I believe this is a drawing done by Bernini or Michelangelo before the original St. Peter's was demolished and then rebuilt during the Renaissance period. But we can see, once again, this is a typical aspect of many early Christian cathedrals, in that we would have the long hallway or the nave, which serves as the main kind of sanctuary space. And then on either side of the nave, we have these smaller kind of ambulatory hallways in which we can kind of circulate around and whatnot. And these are usually distinctly kind of cordoned off by these colonnades that we see. And so once again, we can also see that they use the arch quite a bit. Many of these basilicas also make heavy use of the barrel vault and things like that. But once again, this is very major kind of form. Almost all early Christian churches up until the more modern period are going to be using this kind of style within them. So that brings us to the nave, and I mentioned the nave here a minute ago, and it is the long central aisle of the basilica. So if we see here, we have the nave running down the center. In this sense, once we start to adapt basilicas for specifically Christian use, usually one of the apse or the kind of semicircular end is removed, and so we just have one such deal, and then we would usually, kind of add the transept arm, which we see here, which is meant to echo the kind of shape of the crucifix and everything like this. But it's important to note that these, kind of spaces also serve a legitimate function for the most part in most of these churches. So, for instance, the central nave is where we as the faithful would congregate in order to listen to the Mass or the liturgy or whatever. And then the apse space down here is usually where the altar space would be located. Specifically, in this sense, it would be located in this kind of gray semicircular area here. And then once again, the transept arm usually serves the function of housing either the choir or the baptistry usually. So once again, they serve a very specific kind of function. But we can also see that the kind of ambulatory hallway that goes around also begins to serve a function in terms of pilgrimage sites. So we might have smaller kind of altars or niches and things like that that the faithful could then make smaller offerings or prayers at. So we can see that referenced back here with these smaller apps behind the main one. So these would also contain smaller altars to patron saints or holy figures, all of this kind of deal. And we'll get a little bit more into this in a second. But another aspect of early Christian church art is it's decorated primarily by mosaics. So as opposed to say, painting or stained glass, a lot of the earliest, Byzantine kind of representations within church architecture and other places is going to be made through mosaic work. And mosaics are made up of what are known as tesserae. And these are small pieces of colored glass or marble or precious stone that are used to create mosaics. So here we can see a variety of different kinds of tesserae. They're like little small tiles, if you will. But once again, we can use a variety of different, stones and whatnot to make different colors and all of that. And this, once again, has its birth in ancient Roman aesthetic. These, kind of mosaic works were used quite extensively in like floor decorations, wall decorations, etc., etc., etc. But once again, it's a kind of a holdover there as well. Now, transitions between early Christian and Byzantine style is evident in the churches at Ravenna. So in 404 CE, the Western Roman Emperor had moved the capital to Ravenna from Rome in order to kind of stave off barbarian invasions. Ravenna is kind of surrounded by marshy swampland, and so it was thought to be kind of a natural barrier. But after the fall in 476, Ravenna remains a very important administrative center of northern Italy and of this kind of former Western territory. But in the year 504 CE, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, or Byzantine Emperor Justinian, recaptures Ravenna in an attempt to recapture and restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. And as such, he makes Ravenna a showpiece of not only Byzantine art, but also to promote his own power and his own grandeur as well. And so here we can see a map of Justinian's reconquest of the former Roman Empire. So he's actually fairly, successful in that he recaptures, all of Italy, most of North Africa, and even parts of Spain. Although this is very financially, kind of burdensome on him and the Eastern Byzantine Empire. And so it ultimately kind of doesn't pan out very much after this. But here we can see Justinian's empire at its height. So he does become or get very close to recapturing the majority of the Roman Empire as it once was. However, we can see Ravenna is actually located kind of up in this region up here. But once again, he will begin to build up different things and create this kind of showpiece there in order to promote his grandeur, his power, all of this kind of stuff. But his major kind of showpiece at Ravenna is this, and this is what's known as the Basilica of San Vitale, or Saint Vitale. So here we can see the exterior. It's fairly not too kind of grandiose on the outside. It's all made out of brick and everything. However, when we go inside of this particular cathedral or basilica, the entirety of the interior is fully decorated from floor to ceiling in this mosaic tesserae kind of work. And so here we can see some examples. This is actually a depiction of Justinian and Empress Theodora within San Vitale. So he's actually placing himself on the walls of this cathedral or this basilica in order to, kind of hearken to his ideas of kingly power. It kind of also begins to hearken to this idea of divine right to rule. So Justinian isn't making the same kind of, homage to him being an actual divine being. Rather, he is making this kind of notation or notice that God has sanctioned him to rule in his stead, if you will. And so this is something that many European kings will kind of try to maintain for many centuries as well. But here we can see a fairly typical look of what many of these tesserae mosaics look like. It's also important to note that we can see the faces of these two individuals, and indeed all of the faces within Byzantine art are not going to show any kind of emotional quality whatsoever. They're in fact very kind of adhered to this idea of stoicism once again. So this use of a restrained emotion in order to echo this idea of kingly power and moral steadfastness and all of this kind of stuff. But we can also see here that Justinian is really styling himself in the form of a Roman emperor. So we can see that he actually has himself depicted in that royal purple. So this is a color that would have been reserved exclusively for royalty during this time. But we can also see this kind of homage to his divine right to rule, in that they are both represented with a halo here as well. But if we look at the kind of further out view of the mosaic of Justinian here, we can see that it is actually very grandiose. And in fact, this mosaic is at least 3 times life size, so it's very, very tall, very big. But we can see a number of kind of homages to Justinian's power in this as well. So once again, we can see him represented with the halo, echoing that divine-like status. But we can also see him in that Roman, royal purple. We can see him surrounded by, this is Maximinius. This is one of the very first, not popes, but a major cardinal or religious figure within the empire. We can also see other, prominent religious figures. So we have one individual holding a Bible here and another one holding an incense burner and whatnot. But we can also see prominent political figures here. These would be meant to be Justinian's advisors, so they also have this reference of that royal purple as well. And then we can also see some of Justinian's army, personal bodyguard. And if we look on the shield here, we can see that symbol of the Cairo, in which Constantine is said to have seen in his vision. So we see it's a P with an X cutting through it. There. But once again, what's interesting is that this is also meant to represent this whole idea that Justinian is on par with the divine, kind of beings. In other representations of Justinian throughout this church, he's actually placed on the same scale as figures like Christ. Or at least just barely smaller than them. So within that hierarchical scale kind of idea, he's basically upplaying his importance on an almost divine-like kind of status and everything like this. However, we also do begin to see a lot of different, representations within these mosaic works that also become synonymous with other major Christian symbolic motifs within, the Middle Ages and even up into the present day. So here we can see the mosaic that is situated in the apse of San Vitale, just above the high altar. So we would be, if we were looking at the altar space, it'd be just below this. But we see a major symbolic motif that's used throughout this period time and time again, and we'll see a ton of examples of it today. And that is this idea of Christ the Pentecrator. And so this refers to Christ as the ruler of the universe. So anytime you hear me refer to the Pentecrator, it is a symbolic motif that is designed to represent Christ as being the ruler of the universe, if you will. And so this is echoed by the fact that Christ, the figure of Christ here, is also depicted in that royal purple. So it's, kind of echoing that majesty of rulership and everything. But we can also see that he is seated, enthroned on this blue orb, and this orb is meant to represent the firmament. And the firmament is the kind of medieval concept of the universe. So it is specifically referencing the dome of heaven, if you will. And so this is the kind of a way that the universe is usually represented in most medieval artwork. And we'll see this a lot today. So aside from that, we can also see that flanking Christ, he would actually be the tallest figure in this. If he stood up, he would be a little bit bigger than the other figures. But we can see 2 of the archangels. I believe these are meant to be Michael and Gabriel. here. But on either side, we also see earthly patrons. And so one of these is meant to be, I believe this is supposed to be Maximinius as well. So we can see him in that royal purple. But these would be the donors or the patrons who actually built the church. And so we can see this individual is presenting a model of San Vitale almost as an offering or a sacrifice to the figures of these holy figures here, in essence, kind of cementing this kind of legitimacy, if you will. So this figure not only depicted in royal purple alongside Christ, this would be a prominent church official, but this is also hearkening to this idea that these church officials are very important in that they're pretty much the same size as our archangels and everything like this. So it's upplaying the importance of these two individuals. But we can also see that below them is represented what's meant to be a kind of earthly paradise, if you will, hearkening to that idea of the Garden of Eden and, heaven and, all of this kind of idea as well. But if we look throughout, once again, all surfaces, every square inch of this church is completely just decked out in this mosaic work. And so here we can see the main archway leading into the altar area of the cathedral. So in this sense, in this representation, we can see Christ represented up here at the top once again, a little bit more recognizable, Christ-like figures, or at least how we usually see him, beard, long hair, and all that, but also in that royal purple. And then on either side, we can see the 12 apostles and everything like that. So once again, very, very common kinds of representations there. You'll see, Christ and the apostles all the time. We'll see more examples of it today. And whatnot. But if we look in the background here, we can also see that symbol of the Chi-Rho once again. In this early Christian period, this P and X symbol is going to be more predominant than the crucifix itself and everything like that. It's really a little bit later that the crucifix becomes the main kind of symbolic element of Christianity. But just even further, once again, we see a variety of different symbolic motifs that are going to be echoed into all kinds of other, Christian art forms as well. So here we can see the space just above the high altar. So there's that archway that we just went through, and then the apse would be just basically right over here. But this is what's represented here in the kind of ceiling. We have the four archangels. All of them are standing above that orb of the firmament once again. So this would be a kind of homage to their rulership over the universe, being divine heavenly creatures and everything. But in the center, we also see a major symbol, which you'll see time and time again, especially throughout the Middle Ages. And this is the Agnus Dei, or the Lamb of God. And so this is a very central figure. This is actually echoed in this as well. So we can see Jesus here is holding the scroll of the apocalypse. So it is, this is the scroll in which the Lamb of God breaks the seals, which echoes forth the apocalypse, if you will. So you'll see that Agnus Dei kind of motif used time and time again. But the Agnus Dei is also more subtly referencing this idea of the Good Shepherd motif as well, being that, we as the faithful are the flock that, Christ is the kind of arbiter of and whatnot. So once again, very, very common symbols. You'll also see, once again, this very kind of floral motif that's present. This is, once again, usually meant to echo this whole idea of the earthly paradise and, heavenly paradise and all of this kind of idea. Now, it is important to note, and we touched on this a little bit, that early Christian art is affected by a controversy between those who sought to follow the biblical prohibition against idolatry and those who sought to use image as a teaching tool for a largely illiterate audience. So if we are to take the Bible literally, it does state that using any kind of imagery in a religious sense, even a crucifix, is technically considered a mortal sin that is punishable by eternal damnation. So, that's kind of an issue here, especially when we consider, once again, that most people in this time that we're talking about, even kings might be totally illiterate. So how do you teach the stories of the Bible to someone who can't read the language that they speak, let alone read something like ancient Latin or Greek or Aramaic or what have you? So a lot of this is kind of in flux a lot. So Byzantine art tends to strike a balance between these two ideas of not practicing idolatry, but also using imagery for teaching purposes and whatnot. And in that sense, abstract stylization it couldn't be confused with naturalism and therefore wasn't considered to be idolatrous. So by reverting back to abstract stylization of a naturalistic form, we are considered to not be in competition with the divine. So, it can't be misconstrued or confused with, actual physical reality or anything because it doesn't look like reality. And so therefore it's kind of, a kind of a way to get around some of these issues with idolatry and whatnot. But Byzantium had a very tumultuous history with iconoclasm and idolatry and whatnot. So, iconoclast or iconoclasm refers to the image breakers, and these are people who would destroy religious imagery and punish those who used it. So once again, it's kind of, there are sects in Christianity early on that are very much vehemently against the use of imagery within a religious context. And we'll see that again with the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s a little bit later on. But in 726 CE, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III ordered the destruction of all images of Jesus, Mary, and other holy figures. So they would actually go into many of these basilicas and they would rip all of this mosaic work down, such as we see here. In fact, the only thing left in this is a crucifix, and this would have been added probably much later during the medieval period and everything like that. But once again, this is a kind of major controversy. Obviously there's debate on it even still to this day. I don't think many people really have that much of an issue with religious imagery at this point. Well, it depends on who we're talking about, what religion we're talking about, but generally speaking, we've kind of resolved a lot of those kinds of issues. However, as opposed to iconoclasts who did not like, religious imagery, we also have iconophiles, and those are people who favored this religious imagery. So, in their sense, Christ was seen as God as well as human, and therefore images of Christ combined both the spiritual and physical worlds together. So it creates a link between the two, and this is very important because there's a lot of this kind of Christian artwork early on and throughout the Middle Ages that is trying to hearken to this idea of creating a connection between us in the physical world and the kind of divine figures in the spiritual world as well. So it's kind of an interesting relationship, and once again, depending on what time period we're talking about, this could be very extreme or much more subdued and everything like this. So, once again, one of the major kind of symbolic motifs that comes out of this is known as the Pentecrator, or Christ the Pentecrator. And this is in reference to Christ as the ruler of the universe. So this becomes a very, very common motif. Once again, we'll see a lot of images of it today. Here we see another example from the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul or Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia was one of the first specifically built Christian cathedrals. It was also built by Justinian and very, very large. It has since become a Muslim mosque, owing to the Ottoman Empire and whatnot. But interestingly, Islam actually recognizes the divinity of many of these Christian figures. So a lot of the mosaic work, such as this image of Christ as a Pentecrator, have actually remained intact in the Hagia Sophia as well. But once again, very typical kind of image. We see him in that royal purple once again. In this sense, we can also see another very common way that he's represented with this kind of gesture of blessing. So this is not only a gesture of blessing, but a gesture of prayer and devotion as well. So you'll oftentimes see Christ holding his hands in this kind of gesture. He's usually also depicted holding the Bible as well, and then also usually has this very stylized kind of halo, which also has a crucifix within it as well. So very, very, very common. You'll also usually see them depicted in gold and all kinds of things like that. Excuse me. But once again, very, very common. We'll see several examples of this as well. However, aside from mosaic work such as this, we also do have, Byzantine painting, and Byzantine painting tends to become even more abstract and stylized. And this definitely has modern antecedents in what is known as, the Eastern Orthodox tradition of, Christianity in like Eastern Europe, Russia, places like that, through like icon paintings and things like that. But once again, we can see that it's very heavily exaggerated away from reality, so as not to be in competition with this divine creation, if you will. But here we can see what's seen, a very common scene. You'll see this a lot too. We'll see more examples of this. And this is what's known as the Lamentation of Christ. And so this is the scene in which basically right after the Pietà, in which Christ has been taken down from the crucifix. He is, embraced by, the Virgin Mary, Joseph here, and the other holy figures, and they're lamenting his death before he is buried in the tomb and whatnot. So once again, very, very common scene. We can also see that they're beginning to kind of flatten the space out again. So unlike some of that Roman painting, which is beginning to imply spatial depth, Byzantine painting tends to become very flat as well. Once again, owing to this not trying to be too naturalistic in its representation of the form and everything like that. But once again, this kind of echoes into other art forms that are, really predominant throughout the medieval period. This usually takes the place of icon painting, and another aspect of this in this Byzantine aesthetic, which will influence almost all of medieval art, but also begin to influence artists in the Renaissance and things like that, is this kind of use of gold leaf in the background. So many times in these icon paintings, you'll see this kind of gold leaf background on which we have these kind of abstract stylized figures placed on top of that. So here we have a nice example. This is what's known as the Annunciation. So it's another very common scene that you'll see just time and time and time and time again. But what we see here is the Archangel Gabriel coming to the Virgin Mary and telling her that she has in fact become pregnant by, God and everything like that. And we can actually see it's a little worn out here, but there's actually a line that's coming down into the top of the Virgin Mary's halo. And this is actually meant to symbolically represent God actually inseminating her at that point. So this would actually be meant to be God impregnating the Virgin Mary at that point. So you'll see that that's a very common form within this particular representation as well. But then we also have the Archangel, kind of letting her know at the same point. But once again, we know that this is the Virgin Mary because she's depicted in blue and red, and she's also seated enthroned, which is also very typical of this period. So they kind of aggrandize, someone who would have been a fairly common person at the time or initially, but they, aggrandize her and other holy figures into this kind of place of royalty and whatnot as well. But once again, very, very, very common kind of representation. So here we have just another one. Here we have, this is the Madonna Rucellai. So this is also kind of one of these scenes that's meant to represent the divine-like status of the Virgin Mary. So we have the Virgin Mary and the child there. Once again, blue and red, Virgin Mary every time. But she's surrounded by 6, of the highest order of angels. And then all along the exterior, we also have the 12 apostles and other holy figures as well. So very common, but once again, in this Byzantine aesthetic, we also see that hierarchical scale is usually very, very prevalent. So all of the most important holy figures, such as the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus here, are always going to be depicted in that way. So they're going to be larger than all the other figures. We can also see this whole idea of them being enthroned in heaven and everything like that. That's also meant to be echoed by that gold leaf background, which is meant to be reminiscent of that light of God. So God is usually not necessarily overtly shown. Instead, he's usually allegorically or symbolically referenced by, angels or this kind of emanating light and other things like that. and we'll see more examples of that as well. But once again, we can also see, Christ, the figure of the infant Christ here, is also holding up that gesture of prayer and of blessing and whatnot as well. So very, very common symbolic motifs that once again are used time and time and time again. So that brings us to the Middle Ages in Europe. So this is referring to roughly 1,000-year period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. Now we typically think of this period as being the Dark Ages, and there are certainly dark aspects of it. And everything like that, but it's not really as dark as we tend to think of. There are actually major things that happen in terms of nations being built, literacy starting to become more prevalent again. We start to have, ancient literature being retranslated into common languages as this period goes on, and, all kinds of things like this. But it is important to note that this is a very tumultuous time period. This is a time period of almost constant warfare. People are, almost constantly, either fighting in wars, they're dying of plagues or diseases or starvation. It's just not a very good time period to be alive. So what we do see is that there begins to be a lot of very extreme religious fervor during this period, because people are looking at the instability of the world around them, and then they're kind of hoping for stability in their lives, and so they're seeking that stability from their faith, their religion, and everything like this. But early medieval art takes shape as early Christian art absorbed the art of the Germanic invaders that toppled the Roman Empire. So it's kind of blending these, proto-aesthetics coming out of early France and Germany and other places that are then kind of intermingling and blending with this Byzantine aesthetic to start creating something new. And so there's kind of interesting things happen there. But even the Huns themselves bring influences from as far away as China into this whole kind of quagmire of different influences within the realm of art as well. So some interesting things begin to happen during this period as well. So to begin with the medieval period, we have to refer to the Romanesque. And Romanesque refers to European Christian architecture of the 11th and 12th centuries. So this would be, 10 and 1100 CE. But that's, kind of revived the Roman principles of stone construction. But generally speaking, Romanesque also refers to all artwork made between this time period. So it made very heavy use of the arch as well as the barrel vault, specifically within church architecture, also harkening back to ancient Rome. But this term, once again, applies to all medieval art of this period. Similarly, Gothic art will refer to all, artwork of that period as well. We'll get into that in a second. But, it developed in this very political kind of landscape dominated by feudalism as well as monasticism. And so, if we're unfamiliar, feudalism is the kind of medieval political practice in which the majority of common people are serfs or effectively slaves to the nobility. So, if we were a common person in this period in European history, we would basically have to work on our Lord's land for free. We would get to, take a little bit of food here and there, but we wouldn't be able to travel without their permission. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of stuff. So it's, once again, for the majority of people, it's not a very good time to be alive. But this period is also dominated by monasticism. So there are a lot of monasteries begin to spring up, and these are very important sites. These are not only sites where major trade and commerce takes place, but it's also where many people go to become educated. So a lot of the lesser sons of kings that aren't in line for succession would enter into the monastery. They would learn how to read, how to write. They would make translations and copies of the Bible, all of these kinds of things. But it's during this period that the Catholic Church really begins to cement its power over Europe in particular. And these monasteries become very wealthy. The church itself becomes very wealthy, all of this kind of stuff. But we also see that pilgrimages through isolated locations creates this need for large scale churches and large scale monasteries. And it's important to note that many of these places are built on holy sites where, either something holy is said to have taken place, or perhaps a martyr was, or a saint, or, someone was martyred, all of these kinds of ideas. But we'll see that once again, religious fervor becomes very, very prominent in this period. So here we can see a Romanesque cathedral, this time coming out of Toulouse in southern France. But once again, this is making very heavy use of that Roman barrel vault. So we can see that echoed through the main nave of the basilica here. So once again, very kind of solid structures. These Romanesque buildings tend to be, very kind of heavy and cumbersome in their look. They also tend to be kind of dark. They don't have a whole lot of windows like the Gothic cathedrals of, later times. And this is largely due to the fact that to hold up these large scale buildings, we need very thick walls, which don't really allow for windows and things like that. But a typical example of what a Romanesque cathedral would look like. So we have the high altar there in the background with our apse in the background there as well. We also have our side altars and our pulpits from which the liturgy would be said, and all of these kinds of things. But it's also important to note that, many of these Romanesque cathedrals, this one is very bare at the moment, but it would have probably originally been very heavily decorated with mosaic work or fresco paintings as well, that once again were either ripped off at a certain time or, have just not, lasted the test of time and everything like this. However, we see that the Romanesque style creates this kind of feeling of solid stability in an otherwise turbulent and violent world. So once again, this is a time where almost all of Europe is constantly engaged in warfare. So people are, they see death all around them, disease and things are rife. And so, they really turn to the church for a sense of hope in this otherwise kind of bleak landscape. And so, once again, the church's power and, kind of solidity becomes very, very, well entrenched during this time. But here we can see just another example of a Romanesque basilica. This is the cathedral at Pisa. Now, it's important to note that the Leaning Tower that we're familiar with is actually added much later. But the basilica itself here, once again, is very reminiscent of that ancient Roman basilica style. But we can see that they have, added a bunch of adornment to it. They've also added a transept arm which cuts across, as well as a dome above that transept arm. So this is also a very common attribute of many of these Romanesque cathedrals as well, and in cathedrals in general. But we'll see some other examples of that later on as well. But Romanesque style often features very imaginative kinds of stone carving, as opposed to, say, other forms of decorative art. Now, that isn't to say that mosaic work and fresco painting don't exist, but Romanesque artwork nowadays, especially, is much more well known for its carved sculptural work within these churches. So here we can see one. This is a man confronted by animals. So some of them kind of have a little bit of a humorous aspect. We also see the beginnings of gargoyles and other things like that during this period. So we have these kind of mythical griffin-like features. So we have animal motifs. We also have this kind of plant motif and geometry. Once again, all of these things very, very prevalent. But once again, we see that guy kind of has this like look on his face, in between these creatures and whatnot. But a lot of this sculptural work also takes on certain connotations to the biblical narrative. A lot of it also plays up this extreme religious fervor and this very kind of gloom and doom, like, if you don't obey, like, you're going to hell, and all of this kind of idea. So it really does play up a lot of this kind of fire and brimstone Christianity, if you will. Here we can see one such example. So this is Judas Iscariot, committing suicide with the, help of demons. So, Judas, betrays Christ in the narrative and everything like that. And then later, through his own guilt, he ends up, hanging himself. But in this sense, we see that the artists are hearkening to the idea that he didn't, kill himself out of guilt. It was really more these demons that possessed him to, kill Christ and whatnot are doing it. So kind of an interesting homage there. But once again, we get this kind of horrific use. I often see, these kind of demon-like creatures are referenced in a lot of cathedrals. One particular cathedral in Regensburg, Germany, that I've been to, on either side of the main doorway, there's actually a carved image of the devil and of the beast or the Antichrist, and they're meant to be kind of warnings as you exit after the mass and everything, as to say, as you go out into the secular world, like don't fall victim to these guys. Watch yourself, behave yourself. So many times these kinds of representations, even though they seem morbid to us, are meant to be a kind of moral message to the faithful and those occupying the space, as to say, make sure that you adhere to the faith and everything like that. So it might seem weird that we might be representing demons inside of a church, but it is more of a warning, if you will, to the people interacting with them. However, we begin to see naturalism slowly start to creep back into a lot of this kind of church architecture, especially as we move into the Gothic period. But here we can see a nice example of that. This is sculptural work that would have been or is in association with the portal of one of these cathedrals, so they would flank either side of the doorway. But what we see here are various apostles. So each of the apostles, and once again, it's important to note that these would have been very elaborately painted at one time. We can see some remnants of that, but we would know who each one of them were based on the color coordination. I believe this one is meant to be St. Peter. St. Peter's usually represented in yellow and blue. But we would also be able to see that they have these scrolls here, which would also reference their various, kind of books and testaments and whatnot. All of that kind of idea. So it would also help us to know who each one of these individuals was, all of this kind of thing. And you'll see a variety of different imagery within these church portals. If it's not holy figures like this, it might also be earthly kings who sponsored the church or paid for it. It might also be other holy figures. You also see the Virgin Mary quite a bit, Last Judgment scenes, all kinds of stuff like this. And we'll see some examples of that as well. Such as here. So we also see that throughout the Romanesque period, that hierarchical proportion is still very much a prevalent kind of motif. Here we can see that represented in one of these portals of majesty. So here we can see the main doorways into this Romanesque cathedral. And just above it, we have, once again, a Last Judgment scene. But we have a variety of other elements within this as well, which I find interesting. So in this sense, we also have... this is actually meant to represent Christ the Pentecost, but it also has a connotation to the Last Judgment and whatnot. So we have Christ, the ruler of the universe, once again, situated, enthroned on the kind of orb of heaven, if you will. And we see the faithful on one side and the damned on the other. But we also see amongst them the apostles represented. So down here we have like the faithful and the damned. Then we have the 12 apostles on either side. And then we also have these interesting kind of carvings around the middle here, which are meant to represent different aspects of Christian faith throughout the year. So these would be referencing different things that would happen at different times in the year within the holy calendar and the religious holidays and whatnot. But then we can also see another interesting homage. I've always found this to be rather weird that they did this, but all along the kind of exterior here, we also see carvings that are meant to represent the zodiac signs, so astrological signs. And most of them are a little hard to pick out, but we can see Scorpio right up here, and we could go through if it was a better image and pick them all out. But once again, this is something that would be meant to be read by the faithful as they entered into the cathedral, to be a kind of not only a warning in terms of like don't stray from the faith and everything. But it's also meant to hearken this idea that as we interact within the space, that salvation awaits us, and all of these kinds of ideas. So it's meant to inspire hope, but it's also meant to act as a kind of moral treatise or warning to those who might be kind of going astray from the flock, if you will, and all of this kind of idea. But just because mosaic work or sculptural work is more prevalent during the Romanesque period doesn't mean that painting and other things like that don't exist. Here we have an example of Romanesque painting. Once again, here we can see Christ the Pantocrator once again. So here we see Christ in that royal purple, seated enthroned on the orb of the firmament there. We can see him holding that gesture of faith and a blessing. We can see that he's surrounded by the seraphim angels, and then on the bottom here by other holy figures. So we see the Virgin Mary, Joseph, the other major apostles and whatnot. So once again, it's fairly typical. Once again, we also see that this is meant to be abstracted away from natural reality, so it's not to be in competition with the divine creation and whatnot. But once again, very, very common. You'll see a lot of the exact same motifs just over and over and over and over again. It's almost like beating a dead horse with a stick at this point, but we'll see some more of this as well. So just another example of, one of these kind of apse paintings above the high altar of a Romanesque cathedral. So here we have the Virgin and Child in Majesty with the Adoration of the Magi as well. So once again, we have, the Virgin Mary and Child. So once again, depicted in blue and red, enthroned in heaven, if you will. So we see that echoed by the halo, which is meant to or at least reference this radiant light of God and all of that. But we can also see the figure of the infant Jesus also holding his hand in prayer and a blessing there. We can also see that he's holding the scroll of the apocalypse as well. And they are surrounded on either side by Michael and Gabriel, the two archangels, or two of the archangels. And then we have the three wise men, or the three kings, or the magi, if you will, offering up their offerings of frankincense, gold, and myrrh to the holy figures there, and everything like that. So once again, all of the major kind of highlights of the biblical narrative are usually represented in these kinds of depictions. So you'll see, the Virgin Mary and Jesus enthroned, or Christ the Pantocrator, or holy figures, the Annunciation, all of these kinds of things. Very, very, very common. But that brings us to the Gothic period. And so the Gothic period begins in roughly 1145 CE and basically goes until the beginning of the Renaissance. But once again, it's most clearly associated with architecture, but Gothic is a kind of blanket term that refers to all artwork made during this period. So between roughly 1145 and 1380 or 1400, somewhere in that time period. So Romanesque round arches begin to be replaced by Gothic pointed arches. This is the main kind of architectural stylistic shift that occurs, and we will see some of that. But what I find interesting about these Gothic cathedrals is they begin to really kind of echo this idea of the church's power within the realm of the world and everything like that. Here we can see this is Notre Dame de Chartreuse in France. But what I find interesting about many of these cathedrals is how long they actually took to build. In fact, the average length of construction for one of these cathedrals was 75 years. And some of them, like Chartreuse here, was actually built over a 400-year period. Now, that's not to say that the entire church wasn't completed in that time. It's just it was expanded and added on to. And so the final building that we see today was actually built over a 400-year time period. And so we can see some shifts in style there between Romanesque and then later Gothic and all of this kind of idea. But once again, it's kind of an interesting aspect. It's also interesting to note that these buildings would have been the largest structures in Europe at that time. So you would have been able to see them from miles away on the horizon, and it would have been a symbol of not only the church's stability, but also the church's power over society and all of this kind of idea as well. But one of the major hallmarks of these Gothic cathedrals, as opposed to the Romanesque basilica, which has that round barrel vault, is the use of the pointed arch as well as flying buttresses, which allow for very tall, very thin walls with very grandiose kind of, opulence that's placed within them. And so this is important to note because those Romanesque cathedrals are only about as half as high as many of these Gothic cathedrals. And that's because they're using a very, kind of solid load-bearing wall like structure. And so the higher you get, the thicker your wall needs to be to physically support the bulk of that structure. And so you can't have many windows, you can't go very tall, all of this kind of idea. But the pointed arch and these flying buttresses allow us to lessen the bulk of the wall, so make the wall thinner, but it also allows us to extend the wall upwards, and it allows us to open that wall up to have, large scale stained glass windows and all of these other kind of hallmarks that are associated with the Gothic cathedrals. So here we can see that pointed arch right there. Once again, this is kind of making heavy use of that. We can also see the use of that groin vault being used in association with the pointed arch as well. So this would be the high altar, and then just through here would be the transept arm, which would make use of that groin vault to create it. But once again, we can see that the use of those allows us to enclose a very large interior space without having a bunch of columns in the middle here to hold up the roof and all of that kind of stuff. But aside from the pointed vault, the other major aspect of these Gothic cathedrals is what's known as a buttress or a flying buttress. And so this is a stone half arch which is used to support the piers of a pointed vault. So if we see our pointed vault here, then we would see another pointed vault which acts as our ambulatory around the main nave of the cathedral. But then we can see these buttresses, and these buttresses allow for the physical bulk of the wall and the weight of it to be, kind of pushed outwards so that it doesn't physically collapse underneath its own weight. So it, redistributes the load of the wall out to the base rather than, just the pier itself. And so this allows us to not only lessen the physical bulk of the wall, it allows us to build taller, and it allows us to build thinner walls that are open, and we can have windows and, all kinds of stuff like that. But if we look at an example of a flying buttress, here we can see the exterior of Notre Dame de Reims. So this is the cathedral in which all of the French kings were crowned. So very important cathedral there, but we can see those flying buttresses out here, and these once again are acting to hold up the kind of interior wall of the nave and the apse there to keep it from just physically crumbling under its own weight because of how thin the wall actually is. So once again, this is a load-bearing element which helps us to create a more ethereal kind of structure, if you will. But here we can see just another example of those flying buttresses, this time from Amiens Cathedral, also in France there. But once again, we can see that the actual wall itself is mostly made up of glass, and the rest of it is being held up by these buttresses, which are redistributing the weight outwards away from the center. Now, another aspect of these Gothic cathedrals is, once again, the stained glass and everything like that. And so we see that, light filled these upward reaching structures and begins to, kind of symbolize the triumph of the spirit over the bonds of earthly life. And so this is meant to evoke a sense of spiritual elation. And so almost everything about these cathedrals is specifically designed to enhance our spiritual experience. So as we enter into them, and if you've never been to Europe, if you walk into one of these structures, they are massive. I mean massive. I mean, it's almost awe-inspiring to walk into one of them. And not only that, but they're, because they're made out of stone, they're cold, so that it has this kind of physical presence about it. but you walk in and you see all this radiant, colorful light reflecting through the stained glass. We would hear the liturgy being said. We would hear the choir singing, the organ playing, the incense burning, all of this kind of stuff. And it's meant to kind of tug at our heartstrings, if you will, and create this kind of deeper spiritual elation within us, so as to enhance our spiritual experience and make us basically at one with the divine, if you will. So it's hearkening to this idea of the relationship between us in the physical world and the divine in the spiritual world. So it's trying to create a connection between the two. I find that to be kind of interesting. But these stained glass windows become a major aspect of Gothic art in particular. So the Gothic cathedrals don't really utilize mosaic work or fresco painting or anything for their decoration. Instead, they start to embrace these stained glass kinds of representations. And so here we can see one of the prominent examples of this. This is what's known as a rose window, and this is the north transept arm rose window of Notre Dame de Chartres, once again, that we saw a minute ago. But these rose windows usually embody this idea of symmetrical balance, which also harkens to this idea of solid stability. But we usually see a variety of different imagery within this. So in this case, the main central focus of this particular window, we have the Virgin and Child in the center, surrounded by the apostles, surrounded by earthly kings. So French kings who are responsible for, not only bringing Christianity to France, but also who would have been patrons of this major cathedral and the stained glass and all of that. But we can also see represented down here the Virgin and Child once again, and she's surrounded by earthly French kings once again, so as to kind of hearken to the idea that they are, kind of prominent figures in this realm, and that they have divine sanction to rule the French people. But it also kind of echoes forth certain aspects of, there were a couple of French kings that were made into saints and, other things like that. St. Louis was originally a French king, all of these kinds of things. But we see this hearkened in a variety of different things. So here we see the south transept rose window from Chartres once again. In this case, we see that Christ the Pentecrator motif in the center again. We see him surrounded by the apostles, by earthly kings, and other holy figures in this case. We also see another example of the Virgin and Child surrounded by earthly kings as well. So once again, very, very common motifs present in a lot of this stained glass. Will be either holy figures, the apostles, various saints or martyrs, also kings that are responsible for paying for this kind of artwork, all of this kind of stuff, very, very common. But some of these Gothic cathedrals become very elaborate. This is probably one of the most extreme examples of this. This is what's known as the Saint Chapel. So this is actually the private chapel of the French kings in Paris. But we can see that the entirety of this structure is almost completely made out of stained glass. In fact, the walls are really just these little columns that are holding up the barrel vaulting on the top there, or the pointed arches there. So we can see that it can be very, very elaborate if we want. We also see that the entire ceiling is decorated in the symbol of the French kings, so the fleur-de-lis on the blue background there. This is also meant to hearken this idea of the heavens, the stars above us and all of that. But we can see a view looking at the apse of the high altar there and everything like this. But once again, we can be extremely elaborate in some of these cases, and some of it is just beyond grandiose. But once again, it's all meant to hearken the idea of upholding spiritual power and referencing the kind of might and the glory of God, of Jesus, of the divine, all of these kinds of ideas as well. Now, another aspect of many of these cathedrals is their use as pilgrimage sites. So it's important to note that many of these cathedrals are actually built on, supposedly holy locations, or say a site where a saint was supposed to be martyred, things like that. It's also important, if we remember from a while back, In the Middle Ages, one of the popes decreed that every church had to contain a holy relic in order to sanctify it. So this takes on a part of the kind of pilgrimage aspect, in that the faithful would travel, to many of these different churches across a wide kind of area of land, and they would do this in order to, see these religious relics or to make prayer at these specific places, for various purposes and whatnot. But many of these Gothic cathedrals are built in order to accommodate these pilgrimages, and these pilgrimages. So usually, if we're looking, this is a diagram of Notre Dame de Chartreuse. Once again, but we can see how it would be used by a pilgrimage in this sense, or a pilgrim in this sense. So usually, what would happen, we would enter into the main kind of space. We might, make a prayer at the high altar or something. But we would usually begin by entering into the ambulatory, which is this kind of hallway that goes along the external space of the cathedral. And along the way, we would stop and, light candles or make small prayers at these various little shrines along the exterior. And so many of these cathedrals have a variety of these kinds of shrines that are devoted to patron saints that are associated with the church, or a particular church, or say devoted to the Virgin Mary, or all of these kinds of things. But so we would go along and we would stop at each one and we would make our prayer, we would light our candle, make our devotion, and we would go along. And then usually the more important of these kind of smaller altars would be located in these small apse behind the main high altar here. And so we would pay particular attention to some of these. But then once again, we would kind of amble around and then we would exit back out. And so they do serve a purpose in that regard, aside from saying the high mass and everything like that, in that, they would serve a kind of ulterior function when regular mass wasn't being said, and, all of these kinds of ideas and everything like that. I also think it's interesting, people don't tend to think of that prior to the middle of the 19th century, these cathedrals actually didn't have pews in them either. So there would be no seating. We would actually go and just stand in the middle, or we would physically kneel on the ground and on that stone ground and everything. And this is all meant to hearken to this idea of being one with Christ through, unpleasantry and suffering and whatnot. But once again, it's just an interesting aspect of these cathedrals that a lot of people don't tend to think of nowadays. Now, aside from that, in the Gothic period, once again, we start to have much, much more naturalistic representations, and these Gothic cathedrals become very, very elaborately decorated, not just in terms of the stained glass that's used, but also in the sculptural work around the exterior and everything like that. So here we can see another such sign or kind of representation around the portal of this particular cathedral. This one is Strasbourg there in southern France along the border with Germany. But what's interesting is when this was originally built, Strasbourg was part of the Holy Roman Empire, or what comes to be known as Germany in modern times. But we have here a representation of the three kings, or the Magi. So this would be the adoration of the Magi. So we have the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus there, and we have the three wise men. But what I find interesting about this particular one is that one of our wise men is actually depicted as an African king. And so this is kind of rare considering this time period, in that, we have a medieval German cathedral referencing an African nobleman there. And so that's fairly rare, because most people in Europe at this time would have never even seen someone from Africa, and if they had, it was probably not in a good light. Obviously slavery and all of that kind of nonsense. But once again, I find that to be an interesting aspect of this particular representation, because it's making certain homages. In fact, it's interesting that during the Middle Ages, during this time period, the richest man on earth was actually the Emperor of Ethiopia, and he's actually referred to in a lot of medieval manuscripts and whatnot like that. So kind of an interesting aspect there as well. But we see, once again, these scenes are just all kinds of different scenes. that very, very richly decorate the exterior of these structures. Here we can see this is from Notre Dame de Paris. So this is, the more famous Notre Dame Cathedral. But we have a Last Judgment scene above the kind of portal into the cathedral. So we have the Archangel Gabriel here is holding up a scale, and the faithful is being weighed against their sins and whatnot. And so we can also see the devil over here is kind of trying to influence that weighing and everything to win souls and whatnot. So it's kind of funny. He's pulling on the scale to be unfair. The devil. All of that kind of nonsense. But once again, very, very elaborately decorated. We start to see a little bit more naturalism coming in. This is still fairly stylized in this period, but it's getting more towards the Renaissance, where we're going to start looking at very accurate naturalism once again and everything like that. But here we can see just another example, just showing how elaborate some of these church exteriors are. Here we see Notre Dame de Reims once again. So once again, this is the cathedral where the French kings were crowned. But we see the main kind of portal of majesty here, just above the main entryway. So we can see here the Virgin Mary being anointed in heaven by God. Just at the top here, and then we can see all different manner of holy figures, saints, and martyrs all along the exterior. And this would be meant to be that kind of heavenly choir, that we would be greeted with as we entered into the divine presence and all of this kind of idea. But once again, we can see one of those rose windows up there just in the back, as well as down here. All of this, we can also see earthly kings represented all around. These would be kings that sponsored or paid for the building of the cathedral. We also see a variety of other things like gargoyles and stuff like that. Very prevalent. Gargoyles are meant to be kind of more protective like figures to ward off evil spirits and all of this kind of stuff. So very, very common. But just another example, once again, every one of these cathedrals is going to be somewhat different than the others, although they still represent a lot of the same kind of attributes. In this sense, we have, at Amiens again, once again, all of these different, French kings and whatnot who have, come before the building of this. So hearkening to this idea of the French nobility's claim to divine right of rule and all of this kind of stuff. But we can also see very just kind of elaborate geometric motifs, floral motifs being present once again. So very, very common. Now, just because these major Gothic cathedrals are really using sculpture and stained glass as their major, kind of decorative elements, it doesn't mean that painting and things like that don't exist. They usually exist more in smaller scale churches. There are many of these cathedrals that do have fresco and mosaics kind of imagery in them as well. It's just a little bit more rare. Once again, it also depends on where we're at because of iconoclasm during the 1600s and whatnot as well, when the Protestant Reformation came about. But here we can see an example of Gothic painting. In this case, this is from a kind of French, a smaller French church. But these scenes are all referencing various martyred saints. So we can see usually, the saints are martyred, and they're usually, martyred in very horrific and brutal ways. So a lot of medieval and Gothic era, Christian artwork is really focused on that very dark, kind of the suffering of Christ, the suffering of the martyrs, eternal damnation if you stray from the flock. It's very fire and brimstone. So a lot of it's very graphic, a lot of it's very gory in that regard. So here we can see the saint being martyred in that sense and all that. But we also see other holy figures represented down here, and all kinds of other scenery and stuff like that. But we can still see that even though it's becoming a little bit more naturalistic, it is still very heavily kind of abstracted and stylized. It's starting to get a little bit away from that Byzantine aesthetic in this regard as well, but we will see that within the realm of Gothic painting that is still very prevalent as well. So here we can see just an example of Gothic idol painting, if you will. We saw this a little bit earlier on as well. So this is Duccio's the Maesta, but the Maesta is once again a kind of general term that refers to any scene where we have the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus enthroned in heaven and surrounded by this host of heavenly beings, martyred saints, apostles, all of this kind of stuff. Once again, we can see our friend John the Baptist there. Once again, we know who John the Baptist is because he's pointing upwards. He's also in that kind of fur cloak and whatnot. We can see other major, kind of holy figures. So the apostles in the background, angels and various saints. We can also see, usually in these kind of scenes, you'll also see depictions of the patrons who paid for the artwork. So in this case, we see, these individuals in the front that are kneeling down. These are meant to be the earthly patrons of the artwork, the people who paid for it. So we have one of the popes here. We also have, I believe this is meant to be a cardinal, and then we also have two noble lords who would have been responsible for commissioning this work as well. So, but once again, this is hearkening to this Byzantine aesthetic. Once again, we have that kind of gold leaf background, which is meant to hearken this idea of the divine light, the divine presence, and all of this kind of idea. But once again, hierarchical scale, all of that is very heavily prevalent as well. But, we also have a little bit more elaborate examples of these kind of icon paintings, just to end us off really quick. So this is Simone Martini's The Annunciation with St. Margaret and St. Ancius. So here we have the Annunciation scene in this sense. So we have the Virgin Mary, blue and red, once again. And then we have the Archangel Gabriel announcing, that she has become pregnant by the divine, kind of light and everything. But we can also see referenced right up here a symbolic link to God. So we actually see a ring of the four seraphim angels, and in the middle of these angels is the dove, which is meant to represent the Holy Spirit once again. So if we don't see like a beam of light penetrating the Virgin Mary to kind of symbolically reference that insemination, we might also have this kind of symbolic use of the dove, or a kind of cloud of angels descending from heaven, or a kind of, like radiant sun coming forth out of the clouds. All of these are major, symbolic motifs for God and, representations of God without actually showing the deity itself. So very, very common. But another common aspect of this would be the addition of various saints. So in this case, we have Saint Margaret and Saint Ancius over here. Once again, these are usually meant to represent patron saints of a specific cathedral or church in which this artwork would be commissioned or located at. So these would, create connotations or links between those holy figures in that specific setting and everything like that. We also sometimes, in this case in particular, toward the latter end of the Gothic period, start to have more elaborate kinds of frameworks and whatnot, which are also meant to echo that church architecture and everything like this. So we also have the use of various other patron saints above, each of these kind of points. And then in the center, we have just a golden disc, which is once again meant to hearken to that idea of the divine light and all of this. So once again, very, very common kind of depiction within the realm of painting in the Middle Ages. It is important to note, as opposed to the fresco wall painting that we saw a minute ago, that this is egg tempera on wood panel that's then covered in gold leaf and everything. So once again, this is a smaller, more portable kind of work that could be transported and everything like that. But once again, this is all very common throughout Europe up until the Renaissance period. And then during the Renaissance period, which we'll get into next time, we start to see a kind of shift away from this predominantly Byzantine aesthetic towards more naturalistic realism and all of these kinds of things. So next time, once again, we'll get into the Renaissance and then the Baroque and Rococo eras of European art, and then we'll kind of shift into other forms of representation after that. So once again, thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.